They say the heart has reasons the mind will never understand. But what happens when life forces you to turn those reasons into a contract signed in ink, devoid of love, and yet holding the power to reshape your destiny? Picture this. A brilliant young doctor, Evelyn Moore, stands before a towering glass building in the heart of New York City. The weight of the world seems to press on her slender shoulders. This wasn't supposed to be her life, not after everything she'd fought for, not after she left the city and him behind 6 years ago. Yet here she was on the cold marble steps of Rivers Capital, a billion-dollar financial empire ruled by a man who once whispered promises into her hair and now barely remembered her name, or so she thought. As Evelyn took a deep breath, the kind she'd mastered before performing countless life-saving surgeries, her mind wandered back to the man waiting inside Callum Rivers. The man who now held the key to saving her family's legacy, the private hospital her father had built from nothing now on the brink of collapse. The automatic doors slid open. Evelyn's heels clicked sharply across the marble, each step echoing her resolve. When she reached the top floor, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Callum's walnut desk. He didn't look up, not right away. The tension was palpable. Then, with a voice colder than the winter wind, he finally acknowledged her. "Evelyn Moore," he said, "I thought you'd never dare show your face here again." This wasn't a scene from a romance novel. It was a battlefield of broken trust and unspoken pain. Evelyn didn't flinch. She'd faced death on operating tables. She could face Callum Rivers. "I'm not here for myself," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I'm here for my father's hospital, for the people depending on it." But Callum wasn't easily swayed. His silver-gray eyes sliced through her as if assessing a business merger, not the woman he once loved. And when he finally laid his terms on the table, a marriage contract requiring her to bear 2 children in exchange for the hospital's salvation, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Now pause for a moment. Let's think about this. Imagine you're Evelyn, a renowned obstetrician, a woman who has dedicated her life to bringing new life into the world, now being asked to create life under the cold terms of a legal agreement. How would you respond? For Evelyn, the choice wasn't simple. She thought of her father's pale face, the hospital's crumbling walls, the staff fighting to hold it all together. And though every fiber of her being wanted to refuse, she asked one question. "If I agree," she said, voice trembling, "do I walk away after 1 year, and do I have the right to raise the children?" Callum's answer was clinical. After 1 year she could leave, but custody would depend on her fitness, judged by the very institution they were trying to save. The deal was struck. The ink dried on a contract neither could believe they'd signed. Evelyn moved into Callum's estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in the snowy mountains of Colorado. But no amount of luxury could warm the cold void she stepped into. The house was immaculate, a museum of wealth, yet utterly devoid of life. Meals were delivered to her room. Callum rarely appeared, and when he did, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. But here's where life often writes its own script. One evening during a fierce snowstorm, Evelyn found herself curled beneath a fur blanket in the silent living room. The power flickered. Suddenly, Callum entered, not in his usual tailored suit, but a simple gray sweater. Exhaustion softened the sharp lines of his face. They sat across from each other, two ghosts trapped in a gilded cage. "Do you ever think," Evelyn asked quietly, "that we're destroying each other not out of hate, but because it hurts too much to admit we still care?" Callum's grip tightened on his wineglass. "Don't drag the past into this," he said. "It died a long time ago, but the past has a funny way of resurrecting itself." Days later, Evelyn stared at a positive pregnancy test, three solid red lines confirming not two babies, but three. Triplets. She delivered the news to Callum, bracing for cold calculation. Instead, for the first time in years, she saw a flicker of genuine emotion. A small, stunned smile crossed his lips. "I didn't expect to be this lucky," he whispered. Now let's take a detour from their story for a moment. This twist, an unexpected triplet pregnancy, reminds me of a real-life story I once heard from a close friend who worked in maternal fetal medicine. She told me about a couple struggling for years to conceive. After finally succeeding through IVF, they were prepared for one baby only to discover triplets at the first ultrasound. The mother's reaction, equal parts terror and awe. The father, he fainted right there in the exam room. Parenthood has a way of turning even the most controlled lives upside down. And for Callum Rivers, a man who tried to control every aspect of this arrangement, it was no different. He spared no expense. A full prenatal medical team was hired. Nutritionists, round-the-clock nurses, state-of-the-art equipment transformed the estate into a private hospital. But Evelyn wasn't a passive patient. She was a doctor fiercely protective of her autonomy. When Callum's efforts began to feel like a cage, she pushed back. "I'm not an ICU patient," she told him, "and I get a say." Their clash reached a boiling point when Evelyn collapsed with abdominal pain one night. In the sterile delivery room, as the lives of their children hung in the balance, Callum finally shed his armor. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for thinking I could control everything, for turning you into something to protect instead of the person I once loved." The babies were delivered safely, two boys and a girl, and in that fragile moment, with tears staining his cheeks, Callum's transformation began. But not all wounds heal with the birth of new life. Despite Callum's sincere efforts as a father, changing diapers, staying up through sleepless nights, Evelyn still felt like part of a plan. Love, she knew, could not be mandated by a contract, so she made the hardest choice of all. She left. Taking the triplets to Portland, Evelyn built a new life, quiet, anonymous, self-reliant. Gone were the grand estates and sterile wealth. In their place, a small apartment, simple routines, the pure, unfiltered love between a mother and her children. 7 months passed. Then in a quiet bookstore, fate intervened. Callum stood there mere feet away, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. "I'm not here to take anyone back," he said softly. "I just wanted to say I understand why you left. And I'm sorry not for the contract, but for not asking if you were okay." Now here's where their story holds a lesson for all of us. Control can build empires, but it cannot create love. And true strength lies not in dominating others, but in understanding them. Callum began visiting Evelyn and the children not as a CEO, but as a father learning clumsily, imperfectly to be present. One day Evelyn returned home to find him lying on the floor, the triplets climbing over him, a made-up story tumbling from his lips. "I don't know how to be a father," he confessed, "but every time Lily grabs my finger, I know I can't be who I used to be." Evelyn smiled, her defenses softening. I didn't know how to be a mother either, she said, but they taught me. And sometimes love, like life itself, finds its way through the smallest cracks. One ordinary morning, Callum placed a simple silver ring in Evelyn's hand. You started with control, she whispered, but you ended with love. And as they stood in the quiet kitchen, the laughter of children filling the air, Evelyn realized something profound. Love doesn't have to be loud. It just has to show up. Have you ever had a moment where pretending led to something unexpectedly real? Please comment below and like this video if you believe the best love stories start with honesty. Subscribe our channel now for more powerful story-based videos every day. Life is never a straight line. It loops, twists, and turns in ways no one can predict. No contract, no corporate strategy, no 5-year plan can account for the human heart. And as Callum and Evelyn's unlikely journey continued, that truth became impossible to ignore. In the weeks that followed their quiet moment in the kitchen, something subtle began to shift. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Callum didn't rush to reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he chose to simply be present. And in doing so, he taught a lesson many of us overlook. Sometimes the greatest act of love is patience. Every morning he would appear not in a tailored suit, but in worn jeans and a faded sweater, often with one of the twins clinging to his leg. He learned the rhythms of Evelyn's new life, the morning walks through the park, the baby yoga sessions in their sunlit living room, the long late-night feeds when the apartment echoed with the soft cries of tiny voices. One might think this was a redemption arc straight from fiction, but real life and real healing is far more complex. For Evelyn, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Too much had happened. The contract had been signed in desperation, not love. The memories of their cold mansion in Colorado, of her lonely nights pacing beneath the vaulted ceilings, weren't easily erased. Yet Callum seemed to understand this instinctively. He asked for nothing, not forgiveness, not affection, only the chance to be part of his children's lives. And slowly, Evelyn allowed him that chance. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned gold and crimson, Evelyn pushed the stroller through the park. The boys babbled in tandem, while Lily gurgled against her chest. Lost in the simple joy of the moment, she almost didn't notice Callum walking beside her, matching her pace without a word. He carried a small paper bag. I brought croissants, he said with a shy smile. Thought the kids might like them. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. And what about me? You can have the first one, he replied, eyes twinkling. That simple exchange spoke volumes. Gone was the man who once wielded control like a sword. In his place stood a father, a man learning one small step at a time how to give without taking. But even as their tentative friendship deepened, life continued to test them. One rainy evening, Ethan spiked a fever. Evelyn, panic rising, rushed to the pharmacy. When she returned drenched and breathless, she found a scene she would carry in her heart forever. Callum lay sprawled on the living room floor. Lily sleeping on his chest, the twins snuggled close. His voice, low and soothing, wove a whimsical tale of knights and dragons. He didn't even notice her enter. Standing in the doorway, Evelyn felt something shift within her. For the first time, she saw not the CEO, not the man who had once hurt her, but simply Callum, the father of her children, vulnerable and human. Later that night, after the fever broke and the children slept, they sat in the dim light of the kitchen. "I don't know how to be a father," Callum admitted, voice raw. "But every time Lily grabs my finger or Ethan falls asleep holding my hand, I know I can't be who I used to be." Evelyn's heart ached. "I didn't know how to be a mother either," she whispered, "but they taught me." That exchange marked a quiet turning point. Not a dramatic reconciliation, but an understanding, a bridge rebuilt plank by plank. Now let's pause here to reflect on something that resonates far beyond this story. How often do we in our own lives try to control outcomes, and we plan meticulously manage risks, strive for perfection? But relationships, true relationships, don't thrive under control. They bloom through presence, vulnerability, and the willingness to learn. It's a lesson echoed in countless real-life stories. I once interviewed a successful entrepreneur who confessed that fatherhood changed him more than any boardroom ever could. "I used to think success meant control," he told me. "But when my daughter was born, I realized success meant showing up even when I had no idea what I was doing." Callum's journey mirrored that truth. He couldn't undo the past, but he could choose to be present now. And Evelyn, though cautious, began to trust that choice. One morning as dawn filtered through the curtains, Evelyn found Callum in the kitchen hair tousled shirt, wrinkled preparing bottles of formula. The twins played nearby, stacking blocks and giggling. The sight pierced her. No distance, no power games, just a man trying to care for his children. She reached for a cup of coffee and Callum turned something small, glinting in his hand, a simple silver ring. "It's not flashy," he said softly, "but it's real." Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. "You started with control," she whispered, "but you ended with love." They stood there, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. And for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe in this new chapter. Now, one might assume that from this point on, their lives unfolded like a fairy tale, but real life rarely adheres to such tidy narratives. Evelyn still bore scars, emotional wound that would take time to heal. And Callum, for all his progress, struggled with guilt over his past mistakes. They navigated co-parenting with care, building a relationship grounded not in obligation, but mutual respect. There were setbacks, disagreements about routines, moments of old tension resurfacing. But through it all, they chose to communicate, to put the well-being of their children first. And as months turned into seasons, a quiet rhythm emerged. Saturday mornings at the park, story time at the library, silly dances in the living room. Moments so ordinary, they became extraordinary. Friends and strangers often commented on the bond they shared. "You two seem so in sync," one mother remarked during a play date. Evelyn smiled but offered no explanation. Some stories were too personal, too hard-won to be shared casually. Meanwhile, Callum continued to evolve. He stepped back from the relentless demands of his corporate empire, delegating more, spending weekends in Portland. His priorities had shifted not out of guilt, but genuine desire. One crisp winter afternoon, as snow dusted the city, Evelyn and Callum watched the children build a tiny snowman in the park. "You know," Callum said, voice thoughtful, "if someone had told me 2 years ago that this would be my life, I wouldn't have believed them." Evelyn chuckled. "Neither would I." They shared a glance, one of those unspoken exchanges forged through shared experience. And that brings us to the heart of their story, a truth we can all carry forward. Love is not about grand gestures or perfect plans. It's about presence, about showing up imperfectly but wholeheartedly, about learning and growing even when the path is uncertain. Evelyn and Callum's journey wasn't defined by the contract that once bound them. It was defined by the choices they made after the ink had dried, choices rooted in patience, humility, and the courage to begin again. As you reflect on their story, ask yourself, where in your own life can you choose presence over control? Where can you trade perfection for authenticity? Because in the end, love doesn't have to be loud. It just needs to show up. Winter gradually gave way to spring in Portland. The days grew longer, the air softer, and the city bloomed with new life, a mirror to the quiet transformation unfolding within Evelyn's small sunlit apartment. It had been nearly a year since that fateful day Evelyn had stood before Callum's towering glass building. A year since she'd signed a contract she never imagined agreeing to. A year that had changed them both in ways no ink on paper ever could. Now on most mornings, Evelyn found herself smiling not because life was perfect, but because it was real. She still carried the weight of those early decisions, the pain of choices made under impossible pressure, but she also carried three small, luminous joys: Noah, Ethan, and Lily. Their giggles echoed through the apartment. Their tiny hands reached for her with absolute trust. And in those moments, she knew with certainty whatever sacrifices she had made had been worth it. As for Callum, the evolution was just as profound. He had traded corporate boardrooms for playgrounds, conference calls for bedtime stories. The once ruthless CEO now spent afternoons pushing strollers and navigating the complexities of parenting with a kind of fierce devotion that surprised even him. One particularly bright afternoon, they visited the same bookstore where fate had reunited them months earlier. As Evelyn browsed through children's books, Callum knelt beside the twins, helping them choose a new bedtime story. At one point, Lily toddled over to him, clutching a worn plush rabbit. Callum scooped her up with practiced ease. "You know," he said quietly to Evelyn as she approached, "this is the best investment I've ever made." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like something the old Callum would say." He smiled, no trace of the cold businessman she had once faced. "Maybe, but this time I mean it in the best possible way." Moments like these, simple and unscripted, wove new threads into the fragile fabric of trust they were rebuilding. Yet Evelyn remained cautious. She'd seen how easily intentions could be warped by circumstance. Love, she knew, had to be chosen every single day, and to Callum's credit, he seemed to understand that too. He never pushed, never demanded. Instead, he showed up again and again, bringing warm pastries on cold mornings, reading bedtime stories even when work called, learning how to braid Lily's fine hair with clumsy, determined fingers. There was one moment that stood out above the rest. It was a rainy Saturday. The children were restless, the apartment buzzing with energy. Callum arrived unannounced, carrying a bag of craft supplies. "I thought we could make a family tree," he suggested, eyes hopeful. Evelyn hesitated. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, but seeing the eager faces of her children, she nodded. They spent the afternoon tracing little hands on colored paper, cutting out leaves and gluing photos onto branches. It was messy, chaotic, utterly imperfect, and entirely beautiful. Later, as the children napped amidst a sea of construction paper, Evelyn found Callum in the kitchen, rinsing glue from his fingers. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You have no obligation to any of this." He met her gaze with quiet sincerity. "I'm not here out of obligation," he said. "I'm here because somewhere along the way, I realized that being their father, and maybe if you'll let me being part of your life, is more important than anything I used to chase." Evelyn's breath caught. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart trembled. "I need time," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "and I'm not going anywhere." That promise, so simple, carried more weight than any grand declaration. And true to his word, Callum continued to be there, in the small moments that matter most. Not the big cinematic gestures, but the daily acts of presence that build trust one brick at a time. For anyone listening, there's a powerful lesson here, one that extends far beyond the realm of romance. In life, we often seek quick fixes, dramatic resolutions, the sweeping moments that make for good stories. But in reality, relationships, whether romantic, familial, or even professional, are built in the spaces between the grand moments. They're forged in the everyday, in showing up when it's inconvenient and listening, when it's hard and choosing patience over pride. As spring deepened, so did the fragile harmony within their unconventional family. One morning, Evelyn awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices. Padding into the kitchen, she found Callum seated on the floor with the children blocks scattered around them. He looked up, hair tousled shirt, wrinkled, a bottle of formula nearby. "You look, she began, then smiled, "like a very tired, very happy dad." He grinned. "Best job I've ever had." Evelyn poured herself coffee, leaned against the counter, and watched the scene before her. It was unpolished, unplanned, utterly human. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't about contracts or obligations anymore. Maybe it was about something far more real. Later that day, as they walked through the park, Callum paused beneath a blooming cherry tree. "I know I can't rewrite the past," he said quietly, "but I can choose how I move forward. With you, with them, if you'll let me." Evelyn studied him. The man before her was no longer the cold CEO who had once reduced love to a legal clause. He was a father, a partner, a man transformed not by wealth or power, but by the simple radical act of showing up. And in that moment, beneath the gentle cascade of falling petals, Evelyn made her choice. "I don't want perfection," she said. "I want presence. I want someone who shows up not just today, but every day." Callum nodded, eyes shining. "Then that's what you'll have." And so their new chapter began, not with a grand wedding or sweeping vows, but with a quiet commitment to choose love imperfectly and wholeheartedly each day. For those watching, let this be your takeaway. Life will rarely unfold the way you plan. Contracts may be signed, promises, broken paths diverged. But love, the kind that endures, is not born of perfection. It is born of presence, of choosing to show up when it's hard, of listening with your heart open, of forgiving, learning, and growing together. So whatever chapter you're in, whether building a career, navigating parenthood, healing from past wounds, or seeking new beginnings, remember, this love doesn't have to be loud. It just has to show up. And sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that echo the longest. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, made you think, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey.